Welcome to the Study Jam session. My name is Kunal Bhatia. I work as a customer solutions engineer here with Google Cloud. And I work a lot with financial services customers here in Singapore who are very focused on Kubernetes and how it can help them in their IT modernization journey. So in that regard, today we will be doing a Kubernetes lab. And we will do it together using Qwik labs. I will take you through the lab and all the steps through it. And we'll do it slowly so that you guys have enough time to sort through any things that you face while you're doing the lab. And before we get started with the lab, though, let me spend a few minutes providing some background about containers and Kubernetes. By the way, there's also moderators standing online, available online, in case you need any help throughout the lab session. OK, so as I said, let's just start by building some foundational knowledge about containers and then about Kubernetes. Containers offer a better way to develop and deploy applications. And some of the things that I want to highlight regarding containers, one, containers are all about offering this logical packaging mechanism in which applications can be abstracted from the environment in which they actually run. Two, it's about running anywhere, whether it's your private cloud, your own laptop, data center, or a public cloud. Containers provide the sort of decoupling that allows container-based applications to be deployed easily and consistently across all these different environments. And then the third is effective isolation. Containerization provides a clean separation of concerns so that the application developers can focus on what matters most to them, which is all about developing the applications, looking after their code, whereas the IT operations people can then focus on the underlying infrastructure, the compute, storage, networking, and make sure that that's in top shape in order to support the application better. Cool. With that said, let's also talk about Kubernetes. What if you've containerized an application, you've built a new application, it's containerized, and you've gotten to a point where you're literally running many, many containers, maybe lots of microservices. It can easily become quite a chore then to be able to manage and orchestrate all of those containers as that application starts to scale. And this is where a container orchestration system comes into play. And that is exactly what Kubernetes is. It's a way of managing containers when you're literally doing so at scale with thousands, hundreds of thousands of containers all running at different points in time or even running simultaneously. So what are some capabilities of Kubernetes? First one, declarative management. Kubernetes provides a set of declarative APIs which let you orchestrate your containers. And that means that it has all those built-in primitives that can handle a lot of the heavy lifting that typically goes into application management. Second, Kubernetes provides a portable platform. And really, it's an open source, portable, container-centric management platform that can run on-premises, in the cloud, on your laptop. And lastly, infrastructure abstraction. So it's obviously an abstraction over infrastructure. So all those details that we touched upon earlier, storage, compute, networking, et cetera, that you need in order to run your application successfully, you no longer need to be bothered about that as an application developer. You simply focus on your application, the application logic, and make sure that your code runs successfully. Everything else is abstracted away from you. So to get into some more details or specifics of what Kubernetes does, again, I'm not going to go through all of these capabilities, but the idea is to give you a sense of what Kubernetes handles, which is scheduling of those containers, lifecycle, health management of the containers, scaling your application, whether it is scale out or scaling back in, storage volumes, logging monitoring, debugging, tracing. All of these things are inherently possible within Kubernetes itself. So in that regard, it provides a complete management platform, both in terms of building, deploying, and then managing your application. All right. So what if there was a simple and easy way to be able to build a Kubernetes cluster literally with a single click, where you're then able to view all your clusters and workloads in a single class of plane, and then also be able to manage, deploy your applications from there on. When you think about it, this is exactly what Google Kubernetes Engine is. It's a managed offering, which means that you do not have to worry about setting up the infrastructure, setting up the nodes, etc. You simply give the command to be able to fire up a cluster, and from that point on, that Kubernetes cluster becomes available to you for you to then go ahead and deploy your application workloads. Okay, so now let's get into the specifics of Qwik Labs. First of all, a brief word about Qwik Labs. Qwik Labs is a lab learning environment which helps developers and IT professionals get hands-on experience with a variety of cloud technologies. For today, our focus is really going to be in using this Qwik Labs environment in building a GKE cluster and then deploying a web application on top of it. And just to reiterate the point again, there are moderators available to help you in case you need any help navigating to the correct web page, navigating through the entire lab. These people can be available and help you out as you go along through the steps of the lab. So how do we get access to the lab? When you receive that email invitation to join this particular seminar, this conference, there was also this URL provided to you along with an application code. So go ahead and type this particular URL that you're seeing on your screen now or in the email invitation that came through earlier. It is blog.qwiklabs.com/appdev. And that should hopefully bring you to the screenshot that you see in the screen up there now, which means that you can log in, actually just get in there and click on the Get Started button first. Let me actually try and do that myself so that we can all follow those same steps together. So there we go. Once you type that URL, you should be able to access this particular web page. And once you're in there, go ahead and click Get Started. And that should then prompt you to enter this AppDev conference access code. Again, that should have come through in the email that was sent out to you earlier. If not, just go ahead and type it out. It is 1B, B as in boy, -appdev-759. So I'll go ahead and type that in here, submit, and that then gives me access to this particular Qwik Labs environment. If I read the quick description, not going to read all of it, but it basically says, this hands-on lab shows you how to deploy a containerized application with Kubernetes Engine. So if you're with me so far, let's go ahead and click on this button. And that should then land you onto this page, which is really this entire lab that we're going to be doing today. So there's a bunch of things in there. Let's quickly browse through those in terms of the description of the lab itself. As you can see, this is, first of all, providing an overview of what is it that we're trying to work on, the theoretical aspect of it. Of course, we're working on Google Kubernetes Engine, which provides a managed environment for deploying, managing, and ultimately scaling your application, your containerized application, using Google infrastructure. And we do so obviously using Kubernetes, which is the cluster orchestration system. So it talks a little bit about that. Again, not going to go through all of it. You can read this at leisure at your own time. It also talks about some capabilities of Kubernetes on GCP. In a sense, what are some of the additional capabilities that we provide on top of the basic open source Kubernetes version that you can run anywhere in another cloud provider or indeed in your own environment on premises. But besides that, there are things that we provide as add-on capabilities within GKE, which this particular segment kind of highlights. Things like node balancing, load balancing, node pools, etc., automatic scaling, automatic upgrades of your cluster, logging, monitoring directly into Stackdriver. So all of these are additional capabilities within GKE. OK. And then comes the setup and requirements, prerequisites, if you will, for starting the lab. Now, even though you can see the green Start Lab button on the top right-hand side, I would urge you not to start it right now because this is a timed lab. The moment you hit that button, the timer starts, and there is no way to pause this. So I would suggest let's just hold on, make sure that we've grasped all the things that we need to do before we actually go and hit the button and get started. All right, so we will come to that Get Started button later. But please know that as soon as you click that Start button, your lab will obviously start to run, and the credential console that you see on the left-hand side, almost on the top to middle left-hand side, the connection details will get populated. That means that your username, password, etc. will start to show up, using which we will actually log into a real GCP console. Keep in mind, Qwik Labs is not a simulation. Qwik Labs is not a demo. It is the real thing. So you're actually using credentials that the Qwik Lab environment is preparing for you once you click that Start Lab button, to then be able to go in and log into a real GCP console and actually perform the steps that are mentioned in the lab. Okay, so another quick tip to kind of enter those credentials, rather than hitting the Open Google console straight away, especially if you have a personal Gmail account and such, I would actually give you another tip, which I personally use all the time as well, which is to use an incognito window. So open an incognito window and then go to console.cloud.google.com. That way you will not be prompted for using your own personal Gmail account, which is something you definitely don't want to do for this lab, because Qwik Labs is already providing you with the credentials without you having to create a separate account. So that's kind of a quick prerequisite description of the things we ought to do before we get to the lab. Now let us go ahead and actually try and start the lab and see how we move forward. Okay, so I'm going to click on the Start Lab button. Okay, let's try this one more time. Maybe I'll just restart this and start this one more time. Hang on, let me do another thing. Okay, so as soon as we click on the Start Lab button, you should be prompted for this particular option, which is basically two ways to start the lab, or two ways to pay for the lab, as it were. One is to enter a lab access code, which we're not using for this particular session. But you also see, if you have used that promo code that we provided you earlier, you should be seeing the option to use credit. So launch with 1 credit. And that is what I'm going to click on right now. And it'll take a few moments before the lab actually gets initiated. There we go, the lab's initiated. And then you can now see that the lab is running up on the right side, that the lab is now running. You can see the timer's running. And of course, the End Lab button is also there, which tells you that the lab's actually started. Okay, and what you also see in here is the credentials that I was earlier alluding to: username, password, project ID, which we will be using later when we log in. The next thing I'm going to do is to actually open an incognito window that I mentioned earlier. There we go. I'll manually just go to console.cloud.google.com. And that should ideally land you to this page, which is prompting you to enter your username. I'll go back and click this button next to the username, which automatically copies this email address which Qwik Labs has created for me, which is actually just the username. So go ahead and enter that. And then it prompts you for your password. Again, we're going to go back, just copy the password from Qwik Labs over into the GCP console window. Great. So we have now, if you have entered the credentials correctly, that is, we should be getting this screen. And go ahead and accept those standard terms and conditions that just show up. The next window that should open up, or the next page that should load up, is about protecting your account. And that's really useful when you're trying to use a permanent account, a permanent Qwik Labs account. Given this is just a temporary account or a GCP account, a temporary GCP account, you don't necessarily need to get this set up. So we'll just ignore this and just click Done. And now you can start to see the actual GCP console starting to populate on the web page. And before we can actually use the web page, some mandatory things again, just to quickly complete. Agree with the terms of service, so check that option on. I don't necessarily want to receive email updates at this stage, so I will just go ahead and choose no, and then hit agree and continue. Super. So if everybody's been able to follow the steps so far, and if everybody's on the same page as I am, then you're literally on the page where you've got the GCP console up and running. You're logged in, and you've got all these different options available to you. This is, at the top here, is what we call as the hamburger menu, which lets you then access a variety of different services within GCP. Compute engine, Kubernetes engine, which we'll be using shortly, etc. So you've got all these different options in here. I'm just going to close it for a moment. And the first thing that we want to do is actually go back to our the Qwik Labs environment. And let's also copy the third element that we see here in the connection details, which is the project ID. Let's copy this. And if you're all with me, on this top leftish side of the screen, right after Google Cloud Platform, you see this option of selecting a project. Go ahead and click on that down arrow. Actually, you don't even need to copy that, because you see the same environment also show up here, or the same project also show up here. Let's select that project, because this is the project in which we will be working in. A GCP project is essentially almost a space within which you can consume various types of Google Cloud services, in this case GKE. Right, so we've got all our preparatory stuff done. We have been able to log in. We have been able to set our project ID, and we've gone to a point where our console is prepared. Let's go back to the Qwik Labs environment and now look through the rest of the instructions. OK, so the first step literally is to also expose you to another GCP concept, which is called as Cloud Shell. Now the Cloud Shell, think of that as having a Linux VM, in this case a Debian VM, available to you within Google Cloud, with a 5 GB home directory, with all these traditional programming constructs already built in for Python and other languages, etc., with a lot of different tools and scripts and shells already prepared. So you can actually go in and start doing real work. You can even save your scripts in there. So that becomes almost a place for you to replace, in a way, some things that you would traditionally need your on-premises laptop for. So let's go ahead and activate the shell. How do we do this? If you go to the top right-hand side, you will see this option which says Activate Cloud Shell. I'm going to click on it, which brings up this particular window, which is basically just describing what it's for. And I'll go ahead and say, yes, go ahead and start the Cloud Shell. We chose this as the first step because it typically takes a few moments to literally provision this VM. So we want to make sure we get that done away quickly and then come back to it later. This will take about a few seconds for it to get started. There we go. It's already come up. So now we can go ahead and go through the rest of the steps. So we've started the Cloud Shell. As you can see, we've actually started the Cloud Shell. The Cloud Shell has come up. And what the Cloud Shell lets you do is to basically interact with Google Cloud Platform through the gCloud SDK, which is already preloaded in that shell. You can also download the gCloud SDK on your laptop, on a MacBook, on a Windows, on a Linux machine, etc. But you can also do so directly through the shell that we provide in the cloud. So the first thing that we want to do is to just be doubly sure and ensure that the account name through which we logged in to GCP in the first place is indeed the one that we see when we are interacting with the shell. So I'm going to just copy this command, gcloud auth list, and type it in here. Actually, what I'm also going to do is just increase the font size a bit. Tell you what, I will move this as a separate window. Yeah. Let's turn this into a separate window all by itself, increase the font size, and then hopefully it'll be easier for folks watching this. There we go, it's come up. Let me go ahead and increase the font size. Okay, text size, let's go with large. This should be relatively more visible. I'll go ahead and do a gcloud auth list. There we go. We can see that the active account right now is indeed the one that we chose or that was provisioned for us through Qwik Labs. So that's good. That means we're going in the right direction. Let's see the second step in there. The second thing that we want to verify is whether we're indeed in the right project. So if you recall earlier, I had gone to the web console and I had set the project explicitly, manually. But let's just go ahead and verify that we are in the right project. Again, it seems like we are in the right project. The project starts with Qwik Labs -GCP -whatever. This may be different to, I think, everybody who's logged in, and that's all right. The idea is to make sure that you have a unique project through which you're interacting with GCP. Okay, so we've got some basic GCP preparatory steps completed as well. Now, you see this next step in the Qwik Labs environment being setting a default compute zone. So what's that about? Ultimately, a Kubernetes cluster, for anybody who's played with it before or read about it, you know that a Kubernetes cluster is ultimately a set of VMs or a set of compute instances, bare metal, VMs, whatever. In this case, obviously in the cloud, they are going to be a set of VMs. So in GKE specifically, just for clarification, the master node is something that Google controls as a managed service for you, but the nodes, the rest of the nodes in your cluster are things that you deploy and you control. But those nodes are essentially nothing but GCE, Google Compute Engine VM instances. So given that we're deploying ultimately VMs, we need to be able to explicitly define where, in which zone, in which region I want to set up and provision these VMs. In my case, I want to do this in Singapore. I'm based here, so I'd like to use Singapore. This command here talks about setting the default compute zone to a US central zone. I will copy it, and I will paste it, but I don't necessarily have to take that option. I will go ahead and choose Asia Southeast 1A, which basically means Asia Southeast 1 refers to Singapore as the region. And within the Singapore region, we've got 3 different zones, A, B, and C. In this case, I'm just choosing A. Excellent. So it looks like that property has been updated. And we are now ready to go ahead and spin up the GKE cluster. And it is literally as simple as choosing this particular command, gcloud container clusters create, and then the name of the cluster. The name can be anything below 40 characters. So I will go ahead and start to spin up a cluster. Let me call that Cloud on Air demo. Okay. So once you hit that command, you'll probably see a couple of warning messages come through. That's all right. They basically are talking about some things which are not critical to what we're trying to do right now. The important thing is that in the end, you should be seeing something which says creating the cluster and the cluster name that you called out. So as we can see up there, the cluster is being deployed. Now, the entire cluster will take a couple of minutes to fully get provisioned. But we can do a couple of things in the meanwhile. We can go back to our console and check out a couple of things here. So if we go into the hamburger menu, we can see that within the Kubernetes Engine option in the menu, the first option is clusters. And hopefully we're also able to see here that the cluster is getting spun up, the same cluster that we actually asked to be provisioned through the shell. There we go. We can see that that cluster, cloud on air -demo, is getting set up. The location of that happens to be Asia Southeast 1A, which is Singapore. And another interesting little thing that you may have noticed, or you may have noticed while I was giving that command to create the cluster, was that I never explicitly chose how many nodes I wanted to set up, right? So by default, if you don't provide any options, it will automatically go ahead and set up 3 nodes for you, which is, as you can see, is also validated in the cluster size there. So it's 3 nodes, 1 vCPU each, and 3.75 gigs to every node, and hence a total of 11.25 gigabytes of RAM, which is actually 1 vCPU with 3.75 GB of RAM. That's the standard N1 standard 1 VM option that we have in GCE. Great, so now this cluster is coming up, so that's good. That means that we've kind of, whatever option you're using, whether you're provisioning something through an API, whether you're provisioning something through G-Cloud Shell, whether you're using G-Cloud SDK on your laptop, or whether you're trying to provision this through the web console, they're ultimately all doing the same thing. And that's a good, consistent way to also figure out whether you're going in the right direction and things are getting picked up. There you go. That check mark that we see with a green sign basically says that the cluster's up and running. Let us go back to our console, to our shell. And indeed, you can see that if you go to the bottom, you can see that the clusters come up, the name, the location, the version, etc. So it's all come up and it's running. So that's good. We've got our GKE cluster running with a simple command, literally with a single command. Let's now go to the next step, which is, in this particular case, to fetch the cluster credentials, the cluster CA certificate and such. You want to make sure that you fetch that. So, oops, I needed to update that cluster name. Sorry about that. Let me go ahead and enter the cluster name. The cluster name is Cloud on Air Demo. Yep, and that has successfully fetched the authentication data. And we're now ready to actually deploy an application to the cluster that we just created. In this case, I'm going to be using an example of a web server, and it's just an example. It's a classic hello world type of an example, as cliched as it is, but that's what we're going to be doing here. So we'll pick up a containerized image of a web server application. It's called hello app, I believe. We'll go ahead and fetch this image from Google Cloud Registry, which is a container image running or available in GCR. So we'll go ahead and fetch that, and then we'll deploy that on our GKE cluster. Before we get to that, though, a quick explanation of 2 things that we're going to be doing. First, we're going to be deploying that particular application. And for that, you typically use what we call as, in the Kubernetes world, what's called as a deployment object, which essentially specifies the characteristics and the details of the application of the containerized image that you're going to be deploying. And the second thing that we're going to be doing then is to use the service object, which is a very common object in Kubernetes, is to expose that application outside of the cluster and also offer advanced capabilities like load balancing, etc. So let's use the first Kubernetes object, which is the deployment object, to go ahead and fetch this image, container image, and deploy it on our cluster. So I'm going to be using this particular command. And if you look through it carefully, it's basically kubectl, so kubectl run hello server. I'm calling my deployment as hello server, and I'm saying for that particular deployment, go ahead and pick up this particular image from GCR, Google Cloud Registry. And the last option that you see in there is I'm also instructing it to expose this application within my cluster on port 8080. Cool. Let's go ahead and create this deployment. if all goes well, we should see that deployment getting created, which it has. I can quickly do a kubectl get deployment. And there we go. We can see that the hello server has been created, and it's up to date. It's available. Just got set up just literally a few seconds ago. So this is good. And as I mentioned, we now need to be able to deploy and then expose this application so that people from anywhere in the world can come and use it or access it. For that, I will go ahead and expose this deployment using a service object. Again, if you see in here, I'm using the deployment hello server, which I just created, but I'm also adding the option to add a load balancer in front of it. OK. And that tells us that the service hello server has now been exposed. If I were to do a kubectl get service, we can see that the hello server, which is using a load balancer, has been set up. One interesting thing to also note here is, even though I have a cluster IP allocated for this service, which is an internal IP, I still don't have an external IP. Why do I need an external IP? Well, so that people from the public internet can come in and access this web server application that I just spun up. And this external IP is nothing but a VIP, a virtual IP address that is getting programmed on a load balancer that I've asked Google Cloud Platform to go ahead and provision for me. So as you can imagine, that takes, again, a little bit of time to actually go ahead and provision that. Let's check if it's done yet. No, it's still in pending state. So while we're waiting for this to come up, let me show you a couple other options as well. If we go back to the web console, you can see in there the workloads option shows you the workloads or the applications you currently have deployed on your current cluster. So we can see that the hello server has been deployed. You can see how many pods it is consuming, how many pods it has been deployed on, etc. We can also see the services that we may have deployed for that particular GKE cluster. So there we go. Oh, interesting. So we can see that the hello server, the service, now has this IP address. Let's go back and check that in our, let's go back and check that in our console as well. See if we have an external IP here. Yes, we do. So you can see that the external IP is now populated. I will go ahead and copy this and then try and see if I can access this application on the port that we exposed it on, right? OK. So we can see that we were able to access this page through a public IP, and that tells us that our applications actually has gotten successfully deployed using that deployment that we earlier used, the deployment object. And then by using the service object within Kubernetes, we were able to deploy an additional load balancer in front of it, provisioned a public IP for it, so that your application is now publicly visible, accessible throughout the world. So that hopefully gives you a sense of how quick and easy it is to be able to get things spun up using Google Kubernetes Engine. There we go. If you would have been following the steps down here, you would have been able to see that those same steps, which is the service got set up, the service is up and running. If we were to do a kube control get service hello server in here, we can see that it is using a load balancer. It has an internal IP, which is a cluster IP, but it also has an external IP, which is actually a virtual IP address sitting on top of the load balancer through which this application is now accessible. And that is literally how simple it is to be able to deploy an application on a GKE cluster. We actually got this ready. It's obviously very simplistic, but in a sense, we were still able to build a cluster and deploy an application within a matter of minutes. And that, folks, is really the lab. I hope you were able to follow the steps and you're also getting access to a month worth of all these Coursera courses that we have for Google Cloud Specialization, also available to you, which you can access through the code provided to you earlier. Thank you very much.